On the way home, however, the weather changed. Wind and rain buffeted Edward. His sanding gear failed, his wheels slipped, and his fireman rode in front, dropping sand on the rails by hand. "Come on! Come on! Come on!" panted Edward breathlessly. "This is dreadful!" But there was worse to come. Before his driver could check them, his wheels slipped fiercely again and again. With a shrieking crack, something broke and battered his frame and splashers up and out of shape. The passengers gathered round while the crew inspected the damage. Repairs took some time. "One of your crank pins broke, Edward," said his driver at last. "We've taken your side rods off. Now you're a single, like an old-fashioned engine. Can you get these people home? They must start back tonight." "I'll try, sir," promised Edward.
I originally wrote the script for this video with the intention of it being an MTAX for Edward's exploit. But the more I kept writing, the more I realized what I had to say was more about Edward himself than I did the actual episode. I said I wanted to cover Edward at some point in Sodor's Finest, so let's do it. Edward the Blue Engine is my favorite character in Thomas and Friends. I spelled out before why I think Gordon is the most important character in the series, especially in the Railway series. But most important and favorite aren't the same thing. A favorite is a personal preference for your own reasons. The most important character in Star Wars is Anakin, but my favorite is the Emperor. The most important character in Lord of the Rings is Frodo, but my favorite is Gandalf. Gordon is the most important character in the Railway series, but Edward is my favorite. So I'll now explain who and what Edward is. Edward was the first character created by Wilbert Awdry. That's right, not Thomas, it was Edward. Edward is the oldest one of the main group. He's an aged sage, wise and experienced, and always the voice of reason. He keeps the others in order and isn't afraid to get snappy when they're acting like dumbasses. He's been around forever, and he's seen it all. The type of engine Edward is plays such a crucial role in what he represents. He's a 440, which was, at one point in time, the top-link steam locomotives used on express passenger trains. They were the greatest thing at the time, but they were subsequently replaced by bigger engines that came later. In the time placement of the series, Edward is portrayed as outdated, which was the whole point of his intro in the very first story, but was still very capable of handling the work given to him. Edward is a mirror to everyone else, especially Gordon. I love their dynamic so much, because what Gordon is in present day of the series is what Edward was in yesteryear. Gordon was put in the same position at the very end of the Railway series that Edward was at the very start. Edward has lived Gordon's life. He was a top-link express engine at one point. This brings so much weight to their conversations. It's why Edward chuckles when Gordon or others are being asshats, because he's been there.
"The Fat Controller would never approve," huffed Gordon. Edward chuckled and followed him to the station.
Edward is what Gordon and the others will become later in time. Experienced, aged, matured. Edward's role in the series is pretty constant. Some people have said he's stronger as a side character than a main, and I agree with this to an extent. He's at his strongest when he reprimands others for their actions or gives solid advice to a story's protagonist. There's very few stories that are actually about Edward. When you think about it, most if not all of Edward's stories are about other characters. Edward and Gordon is a story about Gordon, Cows is about Gordon and Henry, Saved from Scrapped is about Trevor, Old Iron is about James. All of the stories in Edward's own Railway series book are about other characters, with Edward just as a constant figure in them and his effect on them. This is true for classic series originals too. Like, Edward, Trevor, and the Really Useful Party is about Trevor. Edward, the Really Useful Engine is mostly about Gordon. In the Brenner era, Old Reliable Edward is, again, about Gordon. PA Problems is about Sir Topham Hatt. The only episode that is fully about Edward in the Brenner era is the one where they write him off the show. Hey, did you guys know that I actually f***ing hate this episode? I don't think I've ever mentioned that before. We get Edward episodes in the Hit era, but I don't even count these because his character is just completely and utterly wrong to the point where I don't even consider it Edward. I detest Edward in the Hit era, because he's usually always portrayed as old and pathetic and full of self-doubt. Edward the Great is the only one I would call decent, but it still suffers from the fact everyone thinks Edward is a pathetic loser.
Edward is a waste of steam, he sniffed.
And then you get ones like Edward Strikes Out, where Edward just acts like a total asshole for no reason. This isn't Edward, this is just like James wearing Edward's skin. As far as I'm concerned, the only eras that get Edward correct are the classics and the Brenner era to an extent, where he's aged, wise, and experienced. And that is where I can understand the struggle that comes with writing for him. Stories with lessons come from having a flawed protagonist that makes a mistake and learns from it, and thus the audience as well. You can't write Edward as super flawed because then he'd be out of character, as per the hit era. So since it's in Edward's character to not make mistakes, he has very few stories. Some people might say that makes Edward a bland, half-baked, uninteresting character since there's not really that much to him on the surface. And to that, I wholeheartedly disagree. And that brings us to Edward's Exploit. The only story in the classic series, and the only story written by Audrey, barring the very first one, that is 100% fully about Edward. Edward's Exploit is fantastic. It's one of the best episodes of the show, but I actually think it doesn't translate the original story to screen as well as it could have. And I understand that's partly to the limitations of what they could do with models at the time. Edward's trial in the original story was so much more dire. In this story, Edward is trying to get a train of enthusiasts home during a bad storm. It's an enthusiast train, and it's packed to the brim. As per enthusiast trains of the 60s, I imagine it's a rake of about 5 or 6 coaches or so. The illustrations depict them as bogie coaches, so they're not small. It's storming out, rain is pelting down, the wind is trying to blow Edward backwards, and all the while he's struggling to get this heavy train uphill. Edward pushes himself so hard he snaps a crank pin, which causes his side rod to go flying and rip his whole side apart. The crew is forced to take off his side rods, rendering one of his 2 driving axles unusable, hence why they call him a single. Edward is tasked with the greatest trial he's ever been put in. To get a heavy pack train home with only 1 powered axle, that's only half his pulling power, going uphill on wet rails with the wind pushing him. The crew tries everything to get him moving, backing him down, putting sand on the rails, loosening the couplings, but no matter what they try, Edward can't get the train moving. It's in this moment you'd think they would give up and call for a replacement engine. If this was James, surely that's what would have happened. He would have thrown in the towel the moment his side got messed up. Would Thomas have kept going? I doubt it. Gordon? Henry? Unlikely. This is where Edward's character triumphs. He keeps pushing himself. He keeps trying, and he never once stops to contemplate defeat. Through gritted wheel slip, he finally inches his train forward. Once it's going, it's a celebration. He's excited, his driver is shouting, the people in the coaches are hanging out the sides, cheering. It's a huge triumphant moment when Edward finally moves that train. And it's from this moment on that all the engines, including Gordon and James, learn to respect him. Edward never gives up. He's this series' Captain America, an old, outdated engine that realistically should have been scrapped 40 plus years prior, but is still around because he just keeps going. It's a crucial aspect of Edward's character that separates him from everyone else. He will wear himself out to bits to the point of total overhaul to save a friend in need. He'll push that heavy train to the top of the hill even when he's the only one trying, and he'll literally rip himself to bits to ensure his passengers' safety before he throws in the towel. And even then he won't, because he refuses to. Despite all adversity, Edward never ever gives up. And that is why Edward the Blue Engine is my favorite character.
So with the fireman standing carefully in front, the driver gently opened the regulator. "Come on," puffed Edward. He moved cautiously forward, ready to take the strain as his tender coupling tightened against the weight of the first coach. The first coach moving helped to start the second helped the third, and so on down the train. I've done it! I've done it! Puffed Edward, his wheels spinning with excitement. Steady, boy, warned his driver, skillfully checking the wheel slip. Well done, boy! You've got 'em! You've got 'em! And he listened happily to Edward's steady beat as he forged slowly but surely up the hill. The passengers were thrilled. Most had their heads out of the windows. They waved and shouted, cheering Edward on. The Fat Controller paced the platform. Henry with the special train waited anxiously too. They heard a beep beep. Then battered, weary but unbeaten, Edward steamed in. The Fat Controller stepped angrily forward. He pointed to the clock. The excited passengers swept him aside. They cheered Edward, his driver and fireman to the echo before rushing off to get in Henry's train.